This is the L3 Leadership Podcast, episode number 208. What's up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the L3 Leadership Podcast. My name is Doug Smith, and I am your host. I hope you're doing well. In today's episode, you'll hear my interview with Carey Nieuwhof. This was the second time I had the privilege of interviewing Carey. You can go back and listen to our first interview in episode number 134. But Carey actually was in town here in Pittsburgh for Amplify Church's Future Forward Conference, and through their senior pastor, Lee Kreitcher, he allowed me to spend some time with Carey and interview him live and in person, and it was just such a joy and such an honor to be able to spend an hour with Carey for this interview. And he's just an incredible leader, but he's also just an incredible person. I absolutely love just getting to know him a little bit more. If you are unfamiliar with Carey, let me tell you a little bit about him. He is a former lawyer, and he is the founding pastor of Connexus Church in Canada. He is host of the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast, and he's also the author of several books, including his latest, Didn't See It Coming, Overcoming the 7 Challenges Which No One Expects and That Everybody Experiences. And we actually spend the entire interview talking about his latest book. I just finished this book 2 weeks ago, and it was the best book that I've read this year. I'm actually making it required reading for everyone that's a member of L3 Leadership and in a mastermind group. It was that impactful. And so the book, again, is talking about 7 challenges that no one expects and everyone experiences. And those 7 challenges, and we dive into this in the interview, are cynicism, compromise, disconnection, irrelevance, pride, burnout, and emptiness. And there's so much that you need to listen to this interview, I'm telling you, and then you need to go purchase the book and just read it. So I know that you're going to love this interview, but before we dive into the interview, just a few announcements. If you are listening to this and you are on a leadership team of a church or you're the senior pastor, I want to let you know about an opportunity for your leadership team that you will not want to pass up on. My friend and pastor of Amplify Church, Lee Kreitcher, who I mentioned earlier, has created a 12-month leadership cohort program for you and your leadership team called the Future Forward Cohort. When you and your team sign up for this opportunity, you'll get monthly webinars, an on-site visit to your church from a Future Forward coach, an opportunity to attend their Change Roadmap Summit in October of 2019, a personalized Sunday visit at Amplify Church for you and your leadership team, and you'll get 6 free registrations for the 2019 Future Forward Conference, which is where Carey spoke this year. So if you are interested in this and want to learn more, you can go to futureforwardchurches.com and click on Cohort. I also want to let you know about something I'm extremely excited about. We are going to be hosting our first annual L3 one-day leadership conference on Friday, March 15th, 2019 at the Marriott in Cranberry Township right out of Pittsburgh. I'm so excited. We have some incredible speakers lined up, and we are going to have our website and registration up on November 1st, so stay tuned for that. But for now, I just want to encourage you, save the date, Friday, March 15th, and plan on attending and bringing your team. We're going to have 300 leaders in the room, and it's going to be incredible. And so stay tuned for more updates on that. So with that being said, enjoy the interview with Carey, and I'll be back at the end with a few announcements. Carey, thank you so much for being willing to take time to do this interview.
Oh, you're welcome.
And I want to spend the majority of our focus today on your new book, Didn't See It Coming, Overcoming the 7 Greatest Challenges That No One Expects and Yet Everyone Experiences. And I just finished this book last week. I think it's a game changer and a must-read for every leader. But I'm just curious from the guy who wrote it, why did you write it? Why now? And ultimately, what do you hope the book accomplishes?
Yeah, I wrote it, Doug, and it is good to be back. Thank you. Thanks for having me again. I wrote it because I've become a student of leadership, like what sinks leaders. And I've also tried to become really a lot more self-aware. So part of the book, part of the story, I've told this story, part of the story quite a bit, is a dozen years ago I burned out. And on the other side of burnout coming back, I tried to figure out, okay, how do I make sure that never happens again? And so I really tried to grow my self-awareness. In addition, we were working on issues in our marriage. I was trying to become a better leader. And I really started running into these issues that had sort of seeped into my life, that I wasn't, you never thought you'd be cynical. You never thought you could easily grow irrelevant because you were the relevant 25-year-old and everything was going to be great all the time. And so I started to see these in my own life. And then in my work with other leaders, I started to see the patterns, like connecting the dots. So, I looked at 9 or 10 I could cover, and I sort of focused in just subjectively on these 7. And I think they are challenges that almost everyone experiences and nobody expects. So that's why I wrote it. And I hope the book feels like 2 things. I hope it feels like hope, because I think we live in a world that really needs hope, and most people I meet are not over-encouraged. They need to be encouraged more. But I also hope it feels like help. Sometimes you read theoretical books, and it's like, well, that's a really interesting philosophy, but I have no idea what to do with Tuesday. And this has really practical hacks as well as the philosophical framework. So it does a meta view, like, oh, this is what happens in life. But then it's like, hey, you don't want to be cynical? Do this, try that, try this, try that, and you can become uncynical.
Yeah. So in the book, you referred to having a conversation with Jeff Henderson and about the book, and I thought this was so profound. You said, if God wants to go deep, it's because he wants to take you far. So let God go as deep as he wants to go. And I believe that if leaders read this book, that God will do a great work in them if they're open to it. I know for me that God used it significantly to point out several things that I'm dealing with that I need to address and that could save me from a lot of the challenges that you share in the book. Can you just talk about letting God go deeper and actually allowing God to work through these challenges and what you share in the book?
Yeah, well, first, Doug, it's horrible when God wants to go deep. I mean, I spent most of my 30s going to see a counselor, just trying to work through, past issues and deal with the stresses of leadership and marriage and parenting and the whole deal. And you go, most guys I know anyway, I can't speak for women, but most guys I know, if you go to a counselor at all, it's like, well, I don't have any issues, but please help me fix my wife, or please help me fix my church. And then you realize, oh, I have issues. Like, I actually have issues. And then you realize, no, I am all the issues. And it got really dark, like in the depth of my burnout in the summer of 2006, I remember, if I'd gone to the doctor, my medical doctor, he would have said I was clinically depressed. And I'm not somebody who struggles with depression. Lots of friends who struggle with it, so I get it. But I was probably for a few months clinically depressed. And I remember just losing hope. And I remember there was a day where my therapist at the time, he just said to me, he said, Carey, you're going to come out of this and you're going to be fine. But just remember this, because some people never get out. And that was the depth of it. Like, I felt like my whole life got deconstructed. And, we talked before we started recording about performance addiction. Well, if you're addicted to performance, and in my case, somewhere along the lines, the wires got crossed when I was a kid, and I thought that the secret to being loved and accepted was just to perform really well, be the smart kid at school, be the best communicator, get top grades, graduate from the best schools, whatever. So, or, best sermon after best sermon, fastest growing church, the whole deal. And, that's just not true. That's not true theologically. That's not true personally, emotionally. But your whole world basically collapses when you realize that's not true. And so that was deep. And I remember, back to where you started the question, my buddy Jeff flew up from Atlanta. We went an hour north of my place to this beautiful resort up in Muskoka. If you know Canada, you know Ontario. Muskoka is like one of the crown jewels. It's just gorgeous, world class. So Jeff and I are walking down the steps to this beautiful lake, Lake Rosso, and, he's 15 days into a 30-day sabbatical going, this burnout thing isn't going away. Like, how do I get this fixed by day 30? And I just kind of laughed. I'm like, well, you can't just, that's not how it works, Jeff, right? And it had taken me like a year to sort of get back to even anything close to normal. And that's when it just hit me. And I just said to him on the way down to the lake, look, if God wants to go deep, it's because he wants to take you far. And he did. In Jeff's case, Jeff's much better now. And, it wasn't 15 days. Fortunately for him, it wasn't a year, but it wasn't 15 days. And he got a lot better. And I look at what God has done with my life over the last 12 years since I burned out. I never, ever would have guessed that I'd be flying all over the world speaking to leaders, podcast with millions of downloads and, books that are I just found out yesterday, this is already being translated into another language. Wow. So I had no idea, but I couldn't have handled that level of responsibility. I wasn't emotionally mature enough, spiritually mature enough. And I mean, some days you're still like, I don't know. But I think we don't know the plans that God has for us. And there was a lot of me when I was burnt out that wanted to resist going deep. It's like, can I just go back to normal? Can this just be a normal day? Can we just get back to where I was 5 years ago? And that was a mistake, because 5 years ago got me burnt out. 5 years ago got me unhealthy. 5 years ago led me into more conflict in my marriage, not less conflict in my marriage. So God said, no, we're going to build a new Carey, and it's going to be painful. Now, just so that doesn't sound like a whole lot of psychobabble, the ancients called it sanctification. That it is the process of being made more like Christ. Wow. And it is the process of the Holy Spirit getting a hold of your life and going, look at this, there's some lies there, there's some untruths there, there's some things that are working against the kingdom of God, and even though you're a Christian, you're going to heaven, these are not from God, so let's get these out of here. And it's painful, it's like surgery.
Yeah, so as you started becoming more self-aware around those issues that were coming up in your heart, what was helpful to you? I know you talked about some people never get out of this. Yeah. What was it that separated you from experiencing, hey, here's some issues I have to deal with, and not growing more hopeless and actually taking them on and taking steps forward?
Yeah, that's almost, it's a good question. It's almost a philosophical question. Like I was having a conversation the last week with somebody who has a daughter who really struggles with depression, like almost bipolar. And that's one of my questions for God, I think. I think all our questions will change when we see him, but it's like, I don't get mental illness. Like, that is so cruel. Because the very thing you think that can make you better is broken. So it's weird. It's just weird. So I know there are people who don't get better. I did. Not that I don't have my bad days, but we all have bad days, but I don't have a bad life, which is different. A few things really helped. Number one, I had to admit it. And that's really hard. If you're a guy, I don't want to admit I have any problems, because I don't have any problems. Everybody else has problems, not me. So I had to admit that I had problems. That was step one. Step two, I had to invite other people into the healing process. And that's hard, like, to accept help. Because particularly if you're a senior leader, like, I was, you are the person who's supposed to give help. Well, I had to receive help. So I had to do that. And then we had an incredible circle of friends who came over to pray. My family was very supportive. My team, the elders were very supportive. And I think that ecosystem, that environment really, really helps. And then I just had to get up and keep going every day. So that was important. And then there's just grace. Like you can have all those ingredients, but there's just a grace that comes from God, and a favor that comes from God, and his mercy, his love, his forgiveness that kind of moves you into a new day. And that's the birth of a new hope.
Yeah. So I know recently we tragically lost a pastor to suicide, and there's people listening to this right now that could be in the middle of their burnout season or the middle of their depression. And I know at one point you said in your depression that you actually felt like, God, will you ever use me again? I don't feel like I'll ever be used of God. And you just mentioned how he's using you today. What would you say to the person listening right now that's like, Carey, that's me. I'm right in the middle of this. What would you say to them today?
Don't quit. Just don't quit. I am convinced you're most tempted to quit moments before your critical breakthrough. I think a lot of people, it just, there is an enemy. There actually is an enemy. And my wife, Toni, and I, this past summer, we talked quite a bit about that, because she was going through her own stuff that she'll write about one day. She's working on a book right now that'll come out in a year or two. But, we had no idea what God would do. And again, it may not play out in millions of downloads or going all over the world or whatever, but it may play out in, you're going to reach 20 more people next year, or you're going to be a better dad for your kids, or a better mom, or you need to be the one who just loves your spouse, right? Like, just think at the most simple level, because we often get grandiose dreams, but like, God has plans for your life, and the enemy hates them. and he hates you. So I think there really is a spiritual battle. I know not everybody would believe that that's true, but I used to think it was true historically until I got into ministry, and then I'm like, oh no, this is very today. So I'm not somebody who believes that every time the toast burns, it was Satan, or like, oh, we don't have enough money in the account. Well, actually, you just spent too much money. You bought too much car or whatever you did, right? Like that's why you don't have money. It's not because Satan's out to get you. But I think when the natural explanations fail, that you have to look at supernatural things. And I think the enemy wants to take us out. And I would just hang in there. You are stronger than he is. Christ is stronger than he is. And don't quit.
I love that. And so I absolutely believe that. And the enemy can take us out in the lowest points of our lives. But you talk about in the book another challenge that you mentioned that I think on the opposite end is emptiness. And so now you're on the other side. You may not be going through seasons of burnout, but now you have millions of downloads. You're speaking everywhere. I'm just curious, now that you've had that success, I know you share in the book about the day your one blog post had more views than ever before. Yeah. On the other side of depression and burnout, what are you learning about success and emptiness? And what would you challenge leaders to think about?
Yeah, I love the way you phrased the question. I think success is actually more challenging to handle than failure. Because most people, failure's hard. Most people like, okay, I'll get up tomorrow. And, as Winston Churchill said, what's the quote? He said, success is moving from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. That's pretty accurate, It's like, yeah, just all you have to do is get back up one more time, then you get knocked down, and you'll win in the end. So, that's failure, and you can get back up. And I think that's key to those people who are in a season of failure. It's like, well, just get up, get out of bed. And I did, and, today doesn't have to define tomorrow. So that's failure. But success is weird. And, we're at the point where what God is using me to do in this season of my life is far beyond anything I ever dreamed. And it goes to your head. It can make you proud. I mean, that is the biblical narrative, right? So just read 1st and 2nd Kings or Chronicles. It's like, well, there was this king, and he was very humble, but then he became successful, and then he became proud. It's like over and over and over and over and over again. And it's just, yeah, of course that happens, because you give yourself a lot of credit. And the other thing that I think, and this is what I wrote about in the book, that is super challenging with success, is you think, I'm not very happy right now, but one day when I get married, one day when we have kids, one day when my kids leave home, one day when I retire, one day when I become the senior leader, one day when my book sells, 10,000 copies, when I get 1 million downloads on my podcast, it's going to be amazing, right? Whatever your marker of success is, or whenever I can take a month of vacation, it'll be the best. So pick your poison, whatever that is. We set these markers, and then we get there. So, I'm a writer. I write a blog as well as podcasting. And, the blog kind of took off when 6 years ago, when I really decided, okay, I'm going to blog seriously. Overnight, traffic tripled, went to 100,000 downloads a month. And I'm like, ooh, this is amazing. And then it got up to 1 million over the course of a year. But, on an average day, it was maybe 6,000 or 7,000 page views, which is really good traffic for a guy who writes out of his house. Like, that's pretty good. So, but, sometimes I had a post that would go 20,000, 25,000. But then there was one day 3 years ago where I wrote on a subject, and by the end of the day, 436,000 people had read that post. And I'm like, what? By the end of the week, it was 1 million. And I'm like, okay, that is actually viral. And I'm not Beyonce, right? So I'm like, I'm not famous. So that was pretty cool. But I was surprised at what that really did. And it was just a reminder, because I've had this moment throughout my life where all of a sudden you start thinking, well, 1 million people aren't going to show up next week, are they? And then am I going to be happy writing for 10,000 people, 15,000 people? What if this is as good as it gets, right? The Jack Nicholson question from that old movie. Maybe it doesn't get any better than this. And why am I feeling empty? And so I think this is a problem for people. I saw this when I was in law. It's a problem for Christians. A lot of us are very grateful. It's not that we're not grateful. We're very thankful. God has been good. But being grateful doesn't necessarily leave you feeling full. And that's different. And so the emptiness of success, what is that? And so many people have it. Pro athletes have it. Lawyers have it. Politicians have it. You win. All of a sudden, you got the seat. And you're like, now what? I thought it would feel better and last longer than it does. Or you get your dream house or whatever, and next thing you know, the basement's flooded, right? So you're like, why is this so empty? And so for me, what that is, Doug, is because this one was probably of all of the issues I tackle in the book, even as I was writing it, I'm like, what is that? What is that? It was almost like a journey of discovery. And the way I framed it and didn't see it coming is, and I think this is, that was over a year ago I wrote the book. It just came out, but you write a year in advance. It's like, yeah, I think that's it. At least it's it for me. There's two kingdoms at work in the world. Kingdom of God, and the other kingdom is the kingdom of me. And the kingdom of Carey is selfish, it's greedy, it's egotistical, it's all about me. Whether, you're walking around strutting your stuff or you're just like checking your stats every hour or whatever it happens to be, that's the kingdom of me. The kingdom of me leaves me feeling empty. And the kingdom of me is a sad kingdom. The kingdom of me, nobody wants to work for the kingdom of Carey. But then there's the kingdom of God. And that, if you can have success, but if you truly, and I think this is a heart thing, it's a yield thing, it's a posture thing, but if it's really, okay, God, this is just, as I remind myself regularly, there'll be a day where nobody listens, there'll be a day where nobody reads, there'll be a day where nobody wants me to speak, and am I okay with that? I hope so. Wow. Because this isn't really about me, it's about God and how God uses it. Mark Batterson, it was interesting, I was telling our church on Sunday, because I preached the message, the section on emptiness on Sunday. And so I gave them a current version of it. So I took a screenshot from Amazon where my book has been number 1, 2, and 3 in religious leadership for 2 months now. And it's like, how can that hold down all 3 top spots? Well, hardcover, followed by the audiobook, followed by the Kindle. Oh, wow. So all 3 top spots for 2 months with very few exceptions. That's pretty incredible. Well, how does that feel? Weird. Because then you think, well, why is it not number 1, 2, and 3 in all of leadership or all books on planet Earth, right? And your mind goes into a very bad space. And then I remember something Mark Batterson told me. He said, every book sold is a prayer answered. Wow. When I first heard that, I thought, that's a really nice spiritual thing to say. Thank you, Mark. Right? But that has really been my song over the last couple months, and he's right. Because it's not about whether it's number 1 or number 11 or number 1,872 on a chart. It's about what God is doing in people's lives as a result of it. When I keep that in mind, I have no problem feeling full. When it slips into the kingdom of Carey, it's pretty miserable.
One thing you mentioned in this chapter that I thought was so interesting, and you talked about it a little already, but you shared about the progression of success and accumulation.
Oh, yeah.
More, better, and different. Can you just share that? Because when I read that, I'm like, wow. And that really, really challenged me.
Well, somebody told me that when I was in my 20s, and if they're listening to your podcast, please identify yourself. It was Trinity, York Mills, Toronto in the 90s, okay? It was incredible. Anyway, but they said that, and I saw it, because I was in law at the time, and I saw that. So the idea is, think back to your student days. You're broke, you have no money, and so you'll take borrowed furniture, stolen furniture, Goodwill furniture, you'll take it, right? So you'll take anything you can get your hands on. But then what happens when you get a job and you have a little bit of money in the bank? You're like, oh, well, I can afford 2 boxes of cereal. So you get 2, or I used to have 1 pair of jeans, now I have 3. So the cycle of accumulation starts with, I'm going to get more. I'm going to get more. And then you have more and you're like, okay, I've got a closet full of stuff. I've got, maybe now I have 2 cars because that little tiny economy car, the compact, that's our second car now. We got an SUV for the family. But then you sort of look around and everybody's got more. And you're like, okay, that's not special. The thrill's gone. So what's next? Better. It's like, well, honey, we're going to get a new SUV. It'll be the top trim level, okay? It'll have like all the leather. It'll be all the electronics. It'll be amazing. And then you're like, well, I'm not going to have Cheetos anymore. It'll be handcrafted artisanal cheese puffs that cost $8. And I'll get those because that's fancy. So that's better. Right? And that's like, well, we're not just going to camp this year. We're going to go to Disney. We're going to have the better vacation. We'll get out of our starter home and we'll have our custom home that we'll design and we'll build. So it's better. And so you go from more to better. And then eventually it's like, well, all of our friends are driving the top trim lines and they're building their houses. So now what? Well, this is where the wealthy go. You go to different. It's like, hey, do you know you can only get this T-shirt at One Infinite Loop? And that's true, actually. If you go to the actual Apple store at One Infinite Loop, because I've been there a couple times, there are things you can only buy there. You can't get them online. They have T-shirts. They have pens.
Is that the shirt?
Actually, I have one, but this isn't it.
Okay.
No, but I have one. It's got like little Facebook emojis on it. It's kind of cool. But you can get stuff only at One Infinite Loop. And so I've got a few of those. Same with the original Starbucks store in Seattle. You can get swag there. Like, you cannot buy it online. They will not ship it. You have to go into the store. But that's where they're like, if you're a wine collector, it's like, oh, yeah, they only made 500 of these bottles. There's only 5 left. And we're going to have one tonight. And you're like, ooh, that's special. Or here's a 1937 edition of The Hobbit signed by Tolkien. Right? Yeah. It's like, whoa, okay, well, that beats your, classic literature version that you bought for $5 at Books A Million. So that's where rare and unusual and, this is our home, but we have a summer home up north, and then we have a winter home down on a private island. More, better, different. That's a cycle of accumulation. So I was reflecting on that in light of Ecclesiastes. And Solomon had it all. He was loaded. So Bezos is just recently, he moved into the richest guy in the world position ahead of Bill Gates, probably because Gates has given most of it away, right? He keeps giving it away. So he makes Jeff Bezos look poor. And when you look at him on a global scale, how rich do you have to be? Because this is actually written in Scripture. I think it's historically verifiable. He devalued silver. That's how rich he was. Could you imagine being so rich that like a natural substance gets devalued? It says that silver was as common as stoneware. Wow. Right? So this guy is loaded. He is known around the world. Israel is a superpower, and he has so much money. And this is actually in the pages of Scripture, because he says, everything's meaningless. I don't know what to do. So I threw parties. I got drunk every weekend. That wasn't very good. I built homes for myself. I built gardens. I was the greatest of all time. He took on LeBron. Like, I'm the greatest of all time. And he goes, what does it mean? It's meaningless. So where does more, better, different lead? Solomon was right. It leads to despair. Because you're like, well, okay, I've got this amazing life now, and it's still not enough. What is that? It's kingdom of me. Wow. That's what it is.
Just add to that. I love that. And so your advice for someone caught in that cycle is just become aware and realize that
leave the planet. Leave the planet, go to Mars, start over again. No, it's actually that's not the advice. Yeah, you're right. It's die to yourself. Yeah. It's I've got to die to the sad little kingdom of me. A life devoted to self ultimately leaves you alone. And I learned this as a boss years ago, particularly as millennials were just sort of emerging into the workforce. Millennials are, and I think this is an accurate label, they're very mission cause driven. They don't want to just get a job and work for a company and get the pension when it's time. They want to know that they're making a difference in the world. And I think that's good. And I realized the best way to motivate a millennial is not like, you work for me. Nobody wants to work for me. I don't want to work for me. We work for a cause. So, at our church, we lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus. That's very motivating. As long as my leadership's about that, I'm going to do okay. If it's like, well, I said so and I'm your boss, it's bad news. And then in my company, which does the blog and the podcast, at first it was just me and an assistant, but now we have a team. And so we crafted a mission statement together. It's simply to help leaders thrive in life and leadership. That's it. We want to help people thrive in life and leadership. Well, we all roll out of bed every morning trying to do that rather than working for Carey, because nobody wants to work for me. So it's that higher purpose, that higher cause. And I think that makes everything better. I think that makes family better. I think that makes friendship better. I think that, because if it's all about you, we live in a very narcissistic age, it's just empty.
Yeah. So to segue into another challenge that I loved was irrelevance. And I think it goes right along with that. And we live in a church world where we're taught you have to reach the next generation. Everyone on stage has to be the age of the people you want to reach, right? These are common pieces of advice that we hear. And so for leaders who are 50 and up, they're saying, okay, I'm no longer the ones on the platform. They can start to fear irrelevance, or that they're going to be irrelevant, or maybe they think they already are just because they're a little bit older than the next generation. Can you talk about that? You said in the book, growing older does not necessarily mean growing irrelevant. Speak to the people who are either fearing that or feel that right now.
Yeah. Well, I do think that irrelevance is almost inevitable unless you're aware of it. Because what happens at 25, you're not irrelevant. Unless you're like really esoteric, you're probably not irrelevant because you speak culture in the native language. But what happens is you set a lot of your patterns in your 20s. So this is actually fairly well researched. Most people, their musical tastes, like the kind of music they like, solidifies in their early 20s. Some people pinpoint it to age 23. Like, so what you're listening to at age 23, that's why you get, these deadheads who are 70 years old, or the Metallica dudes rocking out at 60. It's like, well, that's what they were listening to when they were 23.
Yeah.
Right? And it was cool then. It's just kind of weird now. But what happens is you're pretty relevant in your 20s. You're relatively relevant in your 30s. But around 40, there's a dividing line. And around 50, I go out to breakfast with friends of mine. I'm over 50. And like, they're just complaining about everything. How technology is bad, and young people are bad, and workers are bad. And I'm like, oh gosh, okay. So, irrelevance, it's two things. What is irrelevance? Irrelevance is the gap between how quickly you change and how quickly things change. Wow. And if things change faster than you will become irrelevant. So when you look at the church, as you said, Doug, what's changing faster, the church or the culture? Hands down, the culture. So, and why does relevance matter? Because people are like, why does it even matter? Relevance is a bad word. No, relevance is simply permission to speak into the culture. That's all it is.
That's so good.
Because if you're irrelevant, the culture has a hard time hearing you. They're like, wow, you're some quirky, weird guy from 2003. or you're somebody stuck in 1968. Like, what is going on with you? Like, you're weird. It's like running into a hippie who doesn't realize Woodstock was 45 years ago, 50 years ago. Right? It's like, you're just weird. Now, if you meet a modern hippie, that's a little bit different. But, some guy who's like, guys, the 60s are over. Like, what is with you? And you see that in decor and design all the time, right? I used to do a lot of home visitation. I'd visit people in their 70s or 80s, and it looked like the 1970s. Like, it was crazy. It was avocado appliances and shag carpet before it was cool again. Yeah. And I'm like, how does that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I asked myself, like, how does that happen? And then I realized it because, like we were talking about before with the cycle of accumulation, when you're in your 20s, you take anything you can get your hands on, you'll take it used, but then you save up a bit of money and you go buy your own set, but it's not the good set. It's just, it's better than the hand-me-down stuff. But then you hit your 40s, and if you've done okay, you're like, okay, now we're getting the living room set. Now we're finally going to get a bedroom set, right? And And that's great. It's fantastic. But then you hit my stage of life, and that was a decade ago, and it's starting to look a little dated. And you're like, but it's not broken. We spent a lot of money, sunk cost bias, right? And why would we fix it if it's not broken? And all of a sudden, you realize that's how this happens. And 30 years down the road, you're sitting there, and the leather couch is exactly like it was in 2018, but now it's 30 years old, and all the young people come in, and they're like, what is with you? But they don't tell you. So it's like sales guys who they learned, you got to make 10 calls a day. I'm not a sales guy, so maybe that is what you need to do. But they got their method honed in the 90s or the 2000s, and now it's like, guys, things have changed. Like, if you're still selling encyclopedias door to door, it's going to be a hard thing, man.
Yeah.
Good luck. So, and it's permission to speak into the culture. That's all it is.
Any tips you have for staying relevant?
Yeah. Get around younger leaders. What does tend to happen a lot, particularly for those of us who start things, is You start things with your friends, and 20, 30 years down the road, everyone on your senior leadership team looks like you and is 50 years old. Big mistake. So my team, this is embarrassing to say, it's like 20 to 30 years younger than me, and they are naturally relevant, and give them permission to call you out going, no, nobody really does that anymore. Another thing I do is I do upgrade all my devices. So I try to stay current, because you meet that guy who's like hanging on to his BlackBerry from 2009, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I'm not trading this in as long as it's working. But there is so much you just miss. And so I try to stay up on culture. And I think so surrounding yourself with young leaders. And if you're not in a hiring position, just do some reverse mentoring. Like ask a 25-year-old if you can take him out for coffee and ask him questions, or a 19-year-old.
That's so good.
Like you can do all that. So having a constant supply of younger people in your life really, really helps. And then let your kids call you out on stuff. It's like, Dad.
Yeah. Do you have a 15-second review? I know you just got the new iPhone. Are you loving it? Loving it?
You know what? I do and I don't. I said to my wife on the way over, I spent half an hour today resetting things. So I have the XS Max.
Yeah.
And there's a known issue with charging.
Okay.
So I got to go pick up a wireless charger. They say they're going to fix it in iOS 12.1. But like charging is bad. It's not syncing between devices. So should you upgrade? I would say at this point, I'm not sure. I've still got my 10 at home. I might go back to it. But they'll get all these bugs worked out. But it's probably the buggiest month I've had in tech. So I upgraded to Mojave. I upgraded to iOS 12 on all my devices. And nothing's syncing right. Wow. So I've called Apple, and they're like, yeah. So that is the review. But the camera is super sweet. Yeah. It is really, really nice. And I still haven't made up my mind about Macs versus my wife has a XS. So I really like the feel of the 10. It's sort of a hybrid, but the picture and the video quality is outstanding on it. So if they can get rid of the bugs, I'm going to be a happy camper again, but it's buggy.
Love it. The last challenge I want to focus on before I just let you leave leaders with an open-ended statement is cynicism. So you talked about all your 50-year-old friends, you're out to coffee and all they do is complain. But I see this all the time, especially even in young leaders who may not be getting their way or what they want. You said this in the book, the more successful you become, the more pain you're likely to experience. And you can get to a place where you no longer see people for who they are, situations for what they could be, just potential hurt. And as a result, you close off the people in God. Can you talk to anyone who's been hurt and as a result has just become a cynic?
Yeah, I think cynicism is way more of an epidemic than I even thought it was when I wrote the book, because now we have feedback from thousands of people who've read the book, and they're like, uh-oh, I'm a cynic as well. And what's really been shocking to me is how young cynicism is seeding in the lives of people. So, cynicism, most people, I think, when they're younger, unless you have a really different story, Doug, most people are optimists, right? Like at 18, you're like, I'm going to take on the world and everything, world's my oyster and here I go. And nobody sets out to be cynical, disillusioned, jaded, and bitter by the age of 35, but it happens all the time. So I started to look at, and that happened to me in my 30s. I'm like, how did this happen? And as I went through it, I studied it scripturally. I studied it just sociologically. I think cynicism roots itself in knowledge. So one of the reasons you're so happy when you're so young is because you're stupid. You're just kind of dumb. It's like, oh yeah, our church is going to grow every month forever, and then it doesn't. Or I'm going to hire staff and no one's ever going to quit, right? So and that's good. That's good. So you're naive and you get out there, and then the world knocks you around a little bit, and people leave, and the whole deal. And I tell the story in the book about this couple that I poured into for years, that ended up leaving our church. Long story short, they stormed out one day, said, you don't care about us anymore. And I pulled them aside and I said, man, and they weren't rich. And I said, listen, we have done more for you than anybody in the last 5 years. And I've spent more personal time with you as a family than anybody in the church. Like, I don't know how you can say you haven't done enough. They didn't care. They left. They didn't come back. And there's no happy ending. Wow. And I know I felt for the first time in leadership when that happened, like something in my heart died. And the next time a couple walked in and I saw them at the back of our church and they reminded me of this couple who had left, I thought, oh, I know how this ends. And that's how cynicism starts. Because you're like, oh, you're getting married. Good. And in your brain, you're thinking, wonder how long until you guys have problems, or when's the honeymoon over and and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, you start believing the worst. You go from assuming the best to believing the worst. And because it's based on real problems that you've had in the past. And you go from, you just become this person. And a cynic's friend is knowledge. It's like, oh, yeah. I can tell you all the problems you're going to have with this podcast. I can tell you all the reasons people won't listen. And blah, 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 blah. Well, what dies in cynicism is hope. And a cynic won't change the world. They just tell you why the world won't change. Wow. That's what a cynic does. So when I found myself as a former optimist, and most cynics are former optimists, when I found myself as a former optimist getting into the place where I was just cynical about everything, I'm like, this is bad. And so I think the antidote to cynicism is hope, that I had to learn years ago. I have to hope again. I have to trust again. I have to believe again. And that's really hard because a lot of cynics, they got hurt. That's why they're cynical, right? This isn't relationship number 3 that went bad. This is relationship number 30 that went bad. So I know what all men are like, or I know what all women are like. And it's like, well, wait a minute. If you're going to let your past pronounce a death sentence on your future, you haven't got much of a future. So I got to hope again. I can't be stupid. I got to take all this knowledge I've learned, but I have to reclaim my optimism. I have to hope again. I have to believe again. I have to trust again. And that can be hard.
Yeah. Well, Carey, this interview has been fantastic. Thank you so much for writing the book. Is there anything you want to leave us with today?
No, other than these are all solvable. Like pride, cynicism, burnout, all that compromise, moral compromise, it is solvable. And it's also not, it is inevitable if you don't see it coming. I think those things will happen. But that's why I love hearing from young leaders who are reading the book. It's like, no, you don't have to burn out. No, you don't have to grow cynical. If you do some of these things now, like you can keep an optimistic framework and still, not be an idiot. So I really have high hopes for leaders, and I hope that their lives are better and that they're spared a lot of pain as a result of this work.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for, again, speaking to my generation. Hopefully we won't have to navigate these as poorly as others have. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it. Love what you're doing too. Thank you for building into leaders.
Sure. Thanks.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to my interview with Carey. I hope that you enjoyed it. You can find notes and ways to connect with Carey and links to everything that we discussed in the show notes at l3leadership.org/episode 208. Also, as I mentioned earlier, if you enjoyed this interview, I've also interviewed Carey in episode number 134 of the podcast, and so I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. So much wisdom in it, and so make sure you do that as well. I want to thank our sponsor, Henny Jewelers. They are a jeweler owned by my friend and mentor, John Henny. My wife, Laura, and I got our engagement and wedding rings through Henny Jewelers, and we just think they're an incredible company. Not only do they have great jewelry, but they also invest in people. In fact, they give every engaged couple a book to help them prepare for marriage, and we just love that. So if you're in need of a good jeweler, check out hennyjewelers.com. I also want to thank our sponsor, Alex Landon. He's a full-time realtor with Keller Williams Realty, and if you're looking to buy or sell a house in the Pittsburgh market, Alex is your guy. He's a member and a supporter of L3 Leadership, and he would love the opportunity to connect with you. You can learn more about Alex and connect with him at pittsburghpropertyshowcase.com. As always, if you want to stay up to date with everything we're doing here at L3 Leadership, you can simply go to our website, l3leadership.org, and sign up for our email list, and you'll start to receive weekly emails with everything going on here. As always, I like to end with a quote, and I'll quote John Maxwell today. He said, "I have yet to meet a highly successful leader who wasn't a learner." And the best part is that it doesn't take talent to learn. It doesn't take experience. It just takes the right attitude. Love that. Thanks for listening and being a part of L3 Leadership. Laura and I appreciate you so much, and we will talk to you next episode.